Psalm 18, and we've stopped at verse 19. And I hope you're enjoying this psalm. Thank you for sharing this with me and with friends and family and others that can be encouraged by it. The story of the psalm, best of our understanding, is David running from Saul. And he was in exile away from his home for about 10 years. It was a time of intense survival, a time of intense waiting on God. And interesting, David had slain Goliath. He had been anointed prior to that to be the next king of the nation of Israel. And now this 10-year period of exile, running for his life, he's public enemy number one. The king wants him dead and is in pursuit. And David is running and fleeing and hiding and is continually in distress and turmoil and displacement. And he's writing this psalm in retrospect. So now he's been anointed king most likely, and he's looking back on how God delivered him. And what we studied yesterday was this long section from verse 7 to verse 17 about how God intervened supernaturally in David's life when it was the right time. Now, I want to pick up in verse 17, and we're going to go through verse 19 today. God delivered me from my strong enemy and from them which hated me, for they were too strong for me. They prevented me in the day of my calamity, but the Lord was my stay. He brought me forth into a large place. He delivered me because he delighted in me. Now, I want you to track the timeline here for a few minutes. I want you to see the sequence of events. Verse 17, David said, he delivered me from my strong enemy, from people that hated me. They were just too strong for me. I was helpless and hopeless. We studied that yesterday. Verse 18, he's recalling now in just a few words what really happened. They prevented me. The word prevent is the confrontation. They confronted me. They were a roadblock. They were roadblocking me. They had hemmed me in. I was hopeless. This was the end. Okay, in the day of my calamity. The idea of calamity is distress, or I'm sorry, I lost my place here in my software. Distress or destruction. He says, so they prevented me in the day of my calamity, but the Lord was my stay. My stay is my place of security and my place of trust, my place of safety, okay? So for a season, David is journeying through this day of calamity, okay, to this climactic, cataclysmic moment that we studied yesterday, somehow that God was going to intervene. All this time, 10 years, David is praying, he's seeking, he's waiting, but he's waiting in God, on God, with God. So the Lord was his stay. So my point here is there's seasons in our lives where everything's not going to be everything we want it to be, okay? There are long seasons of our lives that God just says, wait on me. Trust in me. Let these circumstances unfold. Let this difficulty play out. Trust me, I'm going to get you through this. There are times, another way to say it, there are times when God, calms the storm and makes everything smooth sailing. But there are other times that he lets the storm rage on and he meets us in it. And he wants us to walk with him through it, like Peter joining him out on that water in the middle of that storm. Jesus didn't still the storm. He walked to the disciples. He sent them into it. Then he walked out to them in it and invited them to join him in the storm. So David found that God was his place of rest and dependence and sustenance in the middle of this 10-year season of running, wandering, questioning, doubting, fearing, trying to survive, missing home, all of these things. 10 years. It's a staggering thought to me that God allowed David his great victory with Goliath. Just prior to that, he had anointed him as the next king of Israel. He allowed him a season of incredible success and fame, and then he allowed him to be exiled, like driven away from his home. 10 years in reshaping, breaking him down, getting him ready to be the king that he would become. But all of it God's providence, all of it God's plan, and all of it a part of God's journey for David. Now look at verse 19 and think of the contrast from verse 18 to verse 19. He brought me forth. So there was a day that he was pressed in calamity, surrounded. We saw it earlier in the psalm. The ropes of death strangling him, the floods of threat and destruction overwhelming him, and his enemies preventing, confronting, stopping him. But he brought me forth. So there's this moment where God, in his providence, says, okay, it's time to part the waters. It's time to lift David out of this bound up place. It's time to push back his enemies. And we studied yesterday all the supernatural intervention that unfolded in David's life when it was the right time. So what an awesome thought of how God glorified himself in David's life when it was time. And God just basically eradicated all the things that stood in his way. And all of a sudden, the crooked places are made straight. Like God said in Isaiah, the gates are broken open. I mean, there's a way made. I think of times in my life where I was straining and struggling to get out of circumstances, to create new circumstances, I wanted the script to be different. I wanted my situation to be different. And yet I couldn't, I couldn't change things. And God just said, rest, just wait, just go through this, just trust me through this. And then, there were times I can look back and say, yeah, God, there was a time when that season or that event was over and God brought me out. God brought me through it. He brought me forth into a large place, a large open space. Now I want you to contrast that with the idea earlier in the Psalm that God is his fortress, his rock, his high tower. That's a safe place, but that's not a large place. Okay. The idea that we're seeing in contrast is David's been confined. The ropes of death, the waters, the flood waters, and even in his confinement, he was hiding in God, but in dark, rocky places, and yet hopeful, spiritually hopeful, maintaining his own spiritual health, but still confined. Like David couldn't just go out into wide open spaces, into vulnerable places. He couldn't walk through an empty field. He couldn't take a walk through the Jericho River Valley. He couldn't walk up through the Jezreel Valley just in wide open spaces. He couldn't just openly walk the hills of Judea or Galilee. He couldn't be at home and be safe and outside of threat. He had to hide. He was 10 years hiding, okay? He was 10 years looking over his shoulder, wondering what's around the next bend, wondering where the enemy's camping, and just on high alert, on pins and needles, nerves peaked, anxiety levels peaked, always fearful, always on guard, always having to fight for his survival and his safety, even though he's trusting God. And so he says, God brought me forth into a large place. He's saying, he put me in a situation where I can go out into the open. I can walk the fields. I can be completely vulnerable now because of God's provision and God's safety. A large place would be also a place of provision, a place of abundance, a place of security, a grounded, at rest kind of place. So David says, God led me through calamity and allowed it to unfold in my life and allowed it to do the work that it did. But then he brought me forth into a large place. And here he says again, he delivered me. And I love where we're going to land today because he delighted in me. He delighted in David. There's never a time in the whole story, there's never a time in the circumstances of David's life where God didn't delight in David. And if you know Jesus as your Savior, you can look at your circumstances through the same lens that David looked through his. You can see them as allowed by God's providence, filtered through his grace, and purposeful. You don't have to know the purpose. You don't have to see all the outcomes right now. If you're in the middle of them, you just have to rest in him. You have to find him as your stay. And like we said earlier in the psalm, your high tower, your rock, your fortress, your strength. You have to know it with confidence. He's going to get you through this low, this difficult, this discouraging season. I have some friends right now that are just discouraged. I can understand why. It's been a crazy 8 months with COVID. It's been a very strange election season. But, nothing about our hope has changed. Nothing about God's word and all of our promises have changed. And so the exercise is not to pray that God will only change the circumstances around us. No, the real work is that He'll use the circumstances around us to do the work He wants to do in us. And that we will find in Him our strength and our courage and our hope and our joy, and wait for the moment that we get to the end of the tunnel and we break out into that open space again. Wait for the moment that the storm clouds lift, the enemy is banished, and our situation changes. And I promise you this, and I don't know who it is that's watching this today, but I promise you, if you're facing difficult circumstances, by God's grace, holding on to Him, walking forward with Him, there will come a moment when those circumstances will change and you will have been brought through them. There will come another moment, maybe 10 years from now, like David, that you will tell the story. And you will, if you're walking with God that long, you'll be able to see the outcome and the fruit that God is bringing from the circumstances that are unfavorable and unpleasant right now in your life. So don't ever question whether or not God is delighting in you, okay? The fact that you've gone into negative circumstances doesn't mean that you've lost God's delight. The fact that you've come out of them doesn't mean you've gained His delight, okay? He delights in His children, and He always delights in His children. So you have God's delight, whether you are going into negative circumstances, in them, coming out of them, looking back on them, or just getting prepared for them. Wherever you are in life, you can rejoice today in God's delight.